So good evening and warm welcome to the seminar Tigray Crisis, the role of UN agencies in Ethiopia. My name is Katia Donowska and I am interning with the United Nations Association of Stockholm. Before we begin the seminar, I would like to go through some technical information. We are quite many here today. To secure a good quality of sound, please mute your microphones. Feel free to ask questions to our speakers. You can do that by writing questions in the chat. These questions will be raised by the moderator in the end of the seminar. The seminar will be recorded. In the recording will only be visible the PowerPoint and speakers. You can have your camera on. You will not be seen in the recording. The seminar is a collaboration between the United Nations Association of Stockholm and Stockholm Association of International Affairs. So now I am giving the word to the representative of SAIA, Head of Events, Oskar Rosengren, who made this collaboration between these two associations possible.
Okay, thank you, Ketia. As Ketia said, my name is Oskar Rosengren and I act as Head of Events within the board of Stockholm Association of International Affairs. First of all, I want to welcome everyone to this evening's webinar, and I'm very happy to see that so many of you have chosen to join us here tonight. I also want to thank Ketia and the United Nations Association of Stockholm, without whom this event would not be possible to organize. Further, I want to thank our speakers, which will be presented to you very soon, and I hope you will enjoy this hour together with us. Now I give the word to Åse Smedler, who will moderate this event. Åse is a chairman at UNA Stockholm and a former UN resident coordinator with personal experience working in Ethiopia.
Thank you, Oskar. A warm welcome to all of you, and especially to the panel of experts from CPRI, from WFP and UNHCR, who will help us analyze the present crisis of Tigray and the response of UN agencies in such a crisis and the role in humanitarian assistance. I think this seminar has raised a lot of interest among the audience because of the fact that Ethiopia is, first of all, one of the oldest nations in Africa for sure, and even with a long-standing cultural and economic importance in Africa. It is also one of the most long-standing partners in development cooperation for the Swedish Development Cooperation Agency. The capital, Addis Ababa, is the seat of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa and hosts the African Union, which marks its importance in the position of Ethiopia in Africa, as well as its specific position in the Horn of Africa region. So I am, as was said, I am the chairman of the UN Association of Stockholm, Åse Smedler, and I will be your moderator during this seminar. Initially, we will get a political analysis of the conflict between the central government and the Tigray federal state. What were the triggers of the conflict, and is there a way to resolve it in a peaceful manner? The insight on this topic will be given by Jason Mosley, Senior Associate Researcher of the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and also a Research Associate of the Oxford African Studies Center. He's further the manager of the Journal of Eastern African Studies and has a long-standing relation with Ethiopia and the situation in Ethiopia dating back to the 90s. So without much ado, I invite Jason to give his presentation.
Thanks, Åsa, and thanks to both of the hosting organizations for the invitation today. It's a very complicated issue, and I want to try to pull some strands out of the deeper context that will help make a bit of sense of it for further to the discussion. But obviously, the roots are deep, and there's a lot of detail. So I'm sure some of what I say will be somewhat you'll be able to argue with anything I say, of course, but I think it's important to do two things with this presentation. One is to make clear that the conflict that broke out in Tigray was not something that suddenly sprang out of nowhere. It was a sort of slow motion train wreck, as we say in idiomatic English. This thing was coming quite apparently and escalating for months in the lead up to the outbreak of the conflict itself. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is that this isn't the situation in Tigray and the situation in Ethiopia is beyond the situation in Tigray. Conflict and tensions between the agenda of the central government under Abiy Ahmed since 2018 are not limited to Tigray. So the conflict is the most acute in Tigray at the moment, but it's far from the only place where there's conflict. And that's why the only slide I've got for this presentation is this slide of conflict events tracked by the Armed Conflict Location Event Database. It's a project. Between the beginning and the end of October, up until the conflict broke out in Tigray. So this is what the conflict map already looked like before the war broke out. We could have other slides that could show the widespread displacement, for example, but I think this just gives you the context that Ethiopia is not a country at peace. That's been the case during the entirety of Abiy Ahmed's term. And this is from two strands. One is legacy conflict and tension that was building up since 2015, when these widespread protests finally broke out across the country and drove the internal pressures that transformed the government and led to Abiy's emergence in 2018. But Abiy Ahmed's agenda since he took office has also added fuel to that fire. In terms of the policies he's pursuing, but then also in terms of the way that he's transformed the ruling coalition from the structures and the leadership that it held between 1991, when the EPRDF coalition took power, and 2018, or sort of the end of last year, rather, when he transformed it into a single party, except for the TPLF in Tigray, sort of setting the stage and starting the countdown last November 2019 until the conflict broke out in November 2020. All of these things go back, you can pick many dates back in the distant past, but at least you can trace the strands of conflict and the personalities of the individuals driving conflict and politics in the country to the radical student politics and nationalist movements of the 1960s and 70s. The EPRDF, which a coalition led by the TPLF that governed the country from 1991, when it overthrew the Marxist-inspired military dictatorship, those parties were founded by individuals that cut their teeth in student politics in the early 1970s and then went to the bush. When the TPLF, by the end of the 1980s, had largely achieved its control of Tigray area, and its allies in that insurgency in Eritrea were had largely marginalized the government of Ethiopia from Eritrea. The TPLF had a choice to make about whether it was going to try to consolidate its control of Tigray, or actually, if that was not going to be possible without change in the center in Addis Ababa, and it formed this coalition in order to make sure that the Tigray national identity and the Tigray people were secure within Ethiopia, in order to take over the state in Ethiopia, which they did. And that strand of localized, territorial national identity, but within a sub-state framework, it has been the system that Ethiopia has been operating under for the last 29 years, which is reflected in the federal system, which is based on ethno-linguistic national identity. So you have this federation of nations. That was a very important shift that brought in the ability for elites from beyond the sort of historically dominant central groups to get access to power, to get access to the political economy, the way business is done in every country in the world, basically, access to business, access to economic opportunities, corruption, or patronage, or pick your term. The system delivered significantly on a lot of developmental agenda items. A lot of social infrastructure was delivered. But obviously, as we've seen in the last 5 years, it was not quite enough. And that buildup of resentment amongst increasing a population, a very young population with increasing aspirations and expectations created by some of the development delivered by the state, in part, led to this mass outbreak of protests, and that subsequent fracture within the ruling party, which was having a hard time anyway, since 2012, when the founding prime minister and the leader of the party died, Meles Zenawi. They were struggling within the EPRDF, within the TPLF, to come up with a post-Meles architecture, but the protest movement really cracked that. And when Abiy emerged in 2018 as the new chairman of the EPRDF, he faced a challenge that he had the same machine that the EPRDF had been using, which they had used in 2015 to completely marginalize the opposition from every level of the state and the federal system, the local governments. They controlled every seat in parliament. That's the machinery that he came to office with. But he decided not to move away from that into a national dialogue about a sort of political transition and some kind of constitutional reform or anything like that. He stuck to the sort of legal structure, the process, and intended to have elections in 2020, and pursue reforms by the legislative process using the system as it was. But he struggled with security immediately. And by the middle of 2018, there was already an additional 1 million people displaced across the country, in the context of a already very high level of internal displacement. By 2019, you'd had the government in the Amhara region. The president of the Amhara region was assassinated with key aides. The chief of staff of the armed force was assassinated in Addis Ababa. So 2019 were rough. As he's pushing towards the elections, by the end of 2019, he had created the sort of final key ingredient in the tensions that led to the conflict, which was pushing for the dissolution of this coalition and the replacing of 4 separate parties and 5 affiliated parties in each of the regions with a single national party that had federal branches, which raised a lot of concerns about the degree to which this was a reflection of an agenda by Abiy to centralize power formally. Was this a precursor to dissolving the federation entirely? There's a lot of concern about that still. But for the TPLF, this was a step too far. So tensions within the coalition came to the point where they fractured. So the TPLF at the end of 2019, the beginning of 2020, was in opposition. And as we got through the course of last year, as I said at the start, this was a sort of slow motion train wreck. When the coronavirus pandemic, joined the other tensions and strains on the Ethiopian system, including humanitarian issues like the locust outbreak, that led to a state of emergency and the delay to the elections, which had already been delayed from May to August, and then were postponed kind of indefinitely while this state of emergency obtained. As a party in opposition, this alarmed the TPLF, who thought that this could give space to the Abiy and the Prosperity Party to make other changes while they're during the state of emergency, or to sort of abuse that suspension of the normal constitutional process. But in addition, the 2015 electoral mandate was expiring by the end of September, I believe, or early October. And so as the autumn approached and the TPLF rejected the constitutional interpretation that allowed the mandate to be extended, they held their own elections. They distanced themselves from the federal government. They withdrew from participation in the federal system. And the federal government retaliated by talking about holding up fiscal transfers. And so the autumn, September, October, was already a very tense period. And then you have the changes that the central government was trying to make to the command and control structure of the army due to the legacy of the conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea in the 90s. There was a very substantial military presence headquartered in Mekelle and Tigray, which was fine with the TPLF while they were running the show, calling the shots, because it concentrated a lot of military hardware and capacity in their region. But when the tables turned, having that national army presence in your region when you're at odds with the central government has been awkward. There's been tensions over the command structure there. And just before the conflict broke out, there were massacres in Western Ethiopia, which appeared to have been facilitated by the withdrawal of troops from that area. And the TPLF apparently took that as a sign that Abiy was moving troops north to intervene in Tigray, and attacked the Northern Command to take control of those resources and to get under control or kill or exile officers in the National Army based there who weren't going to be loyal or who would be a threat. Where does that leave us? I think there's two things that need to be said. One, just to reiterate, this didn't come out of nowhere. This is the most acute, the most visible manifestation of tensions between different regional groups, different political movements, and how they see the subnational identities and political elites faring going forward on Ethiopia. It's not just Tigray. So this isn't a conflict that needs to be resolved between Addis and Mekelle, or the TPLF and its supporters and the Prosperity Party. This is a broad social and political issue that needs to be addressed at a national level.
Jason, do you expect that elections can be held during 2021?
So in a legal sense, when the state of emergency expired at the end of September, the clock started ticking again on elections. And so the preparations are going ahead, and they're aiming for May, June. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. They can hold elections. They're not planning to do it in Tigray for the obvious reason. Mm-hmm. And they've held elections in challenging conditions before. I wouldn't advise it, but this is the situation Abiy was in 2018, and had the opportunity to convert that sort of popular mobilization. And you'll often read the journalistic shorthand that Abiy Ahmed came to power in 2018 on the back of a protest movement and then immediately set these reforms into motion. What actually happened was the protest movement drove a reform process within the EPRDF, which was already in motion when he came into office. And his taking over as chairman was the sort of final, a major milestone in that reform process. But he chose not to use the popular mandate to start a transition. He chose to having leveraged the moment to take over the formal machinery, he chose to use the formal machinery as it was, and slowly reform it. So it's difficult to imagine him deciding not to push ahead with the elections.
Okay, so maybe during this time it will show whether there is place for a democratic dialogue and a dialogue which leads forward.
Yeah, I mean, but it'll be also difficult to have that dialogue now that the TPLF leadership is illegal and, many of them detained or on the run. And the leaders of several other opposition parties are in jail since the summer of last year. Who would the dialogue be with? And will it capture enough significant political movements to be a genuinely consultative exercise?
Just one little question that dropped in, and I think you have addressed it, about the mandate of the EPRDF, which was transformed into the new Unity Party. You mentioned it was a coalition to gain over Mengistu in 1991. Would you just, with a few words, complete your presentation by responding to whether they had a legitimate mandate?
So I think one of the reasons Abiy is so keen to get on with elections is that he knows that the electoral mandate from 2015 is flawed. You can't win 100% of the seats in the national parliament, even if you don't claim to have won 100% of the vote, and control every state, every federal state, every woreda, every kabele in the country, and after this protest movement, after acknowledging all of the other issues and the flaws that he has, his first big address to parliament, etc., acknowledging that past without acknowledging that there are flaws in the legitimacy of the EPRDF mandate.
Okay, thank you very much, Jason. We will probably come back with under the question and answers to this issue, which is not an easy situation indeed.